Hello, and welcome back for week 3 of remote learning and lesson number 9 of social studies with Mr. Appel. Previously, we discussed in great detail the Constitution of the United States, which was drafted in 1787, ratified in 1788, and went into effect in 1789. Now that it was ratified, our first government came into office, including the executive branch. So today we're going to talk about the presidency of George Washington, which lasted from April 30th, 1789 to March 4th, 1797. George Washington is known as the father of our country. The capital city is named after him. There's a state named after him. There's towns, streets, cities all over the country named after him. What made him so famous? Why is he so revered to this day? Well, much of it has to do with his earlier life, and especially his role before becoming president, especially as a soldier. And he was the commander of our troops during the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783. So after that, he retired and was called back to service to help run the Constitutional Convention, and then again called back to service to become the first president of the United States. So when he took over, he was already 57, which was quite old for that age, that time period, and he had tons of experience though, and people on all sides of the spectrum were looking forward to his leadership as our first president. So let's take a look at some of the issues that were going on while he was president. First of all, as I said, his presidency lasted for 2 terms, 1789 to 1797. There was no limit back then, so technically he could have run again, but he decided to retire. Nobody challenged him, so he was elected unopposed both times in 1789 and 1792. And his vice president was John Adams of Massachusetts. First of all, George Washington set up the first cabinet. And the cabinet at that time was really only 4 departments. The State Department, which dealt with other countries. The Treasury Department, which was responsible for the money. The Justice Department, which was the Attorney General, which is responsible for the laws. And the War Department, which we now call the Defense Department, which was obviously responsible for the military. In his first cabinet, he had a Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, and a Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. And these 2 men were actually rivals, but yet he had them both in his cabinet, which worked out in the beginning because he got viewpoints that he could listen to both sides and figure out which was best. But eventually, their arguments were so great that Jefferson decided to leave the cabinet, and then he had to get a new Secretary of State. But let's talk about some of the issues. Issue number 1 is slavery. George Washington was a slave owner. He had hundreds of slaves on his massive farm back in Virginia. So as a president, he definitely was in favor of seeing slavery continue. And one of the laws passed during his time in office was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. Easily passed in the House and the Senate. And basically what it said was any slave that escapes from the South, if they make it to the North, they are supposed to be brought back. And any slave who escapes who is a child, that child is also supposed to be brought back. So this was quite a harsh law. The Constitution did mention something like this in the actual text, but this made it a new law. So clearly Washington was on the wrong side when it came to slavery. The next important issue that he had to deal with was taxes. And Alexander Hamilton decided that we should have a tax on whiskey. Whiskey is an alcoholic beverage. And the farmers did not like that very much. And it was actually something called the Whiskey Rebellion. And George Washington personally got on his horse and helped raise an army and rode out to Pennsylvania in 1794 and made sure that they paid their taxes. So the Whiskey Rebellion was another major issue. Then we deal with foreign affairs. Foreign affairs means how we dealt with other countries. The same year George Washington was sworn in 1789, a massive revolution broke out in France. We had a revolution here in 1775. A revolution is when a country tries to go against its ruler and they try to kick them out. And it's like revolution, the word revolution means to go around. So it's like the government is going around. Well, the French Revolution, you may say, well, what does that have to do with us here in the U.S.? Well, France was always a very key ally of the young United States. And when the revolution broke out, many Americans were interested to find out about it. And when the news came over from Europe, remember, it took weeks for news to get here on ships. And many Americans were a little happy about it, and many Americans were a little worried about it, especially when the revolution became more radical, meaning that the revolutionaries went very far, farther than we went here at home. The King of France was eventually arrested, and ultimately the King of France was executed, as was his wife, and their son was thrown in jail, and he eventually died in jail. So it was a pretty radical revolution, and the rest of Europe didn't like it very much, and you had a war that broke out in 1792, United Kingdom or Great Britain versus France. So George Washington had to deal with this war. Why? Well, like I said, people were concerned about how far it was going, but now that it was becoming a larger war, it was affecting trade. We traded with both France and England, and this war was disrupting our trade. So George Washington made it very clear in 1793, the United States is neutral, which means we're not taking sides in this war. We're not going to help England, we're not going to help France. However, George Washington did send John Jay, his good friend and a genius at law and diplomacy. He did send John Jay over to England to negotiate with them, and they negotiated a treaty which became known as Jay Treaty or Jay's Treaty, and the US and the UK signed it. And all treaties must be ratified or approved by the Senate. You need 2/3. And the next year in 1795, they did just that. They got exactly 2/3. They needed 30, you needed 20 out of 30, and that's exactly what they got. They got 20 yes, 10 no. The treaty was ratified. And what did it say? It basically said that the US and the UK were going to try to maintain a good relationship, especially for trade, and that the UK would leave our settlers alone because the British still had land in America. Was it a total success? No, but at least it showed that George Washington was taking an aggressive stance at trying to create peace. But while George Washington was president, factions were beginning to be created. Factions means groups of people that are opposed to each other. And the two factions were the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Okay? George Washington was basically a Federalist. Thomas Jefferson, who was in his cabinet, was a Democratic Republican, and he left the cabinet. What did the Federalists believe in? Well, the Federalists were basically led by John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, and they believed in a strong federal government. They usually were pro-British, and they were less likely to like slavery. Not all of them hated slavery, but a lot of them were not pro-slavery. That's the Federalists. The Democratic Republicans actually liked France in this battle. They liked the French Revolution. They believed in states' rights, but they also had a lot of slave owners on their side. Again, not everyone in this party was for slavery, and not everyone in this party was against slavery. It wasn't that simple. But in general, the Democratic Republicans were more slavery-minded, okay? And the Federalists had more anti-slavery people. So that's basically what was going on when George Washington was president. And when he left, that's when the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists started going head-to-head against each other. There wasn't George Washington there to keep everyone together. While he was president, by the way, the day he was sworn in, there was only 11 states. North Carolina and Rhode Island, two of the original 13 states, joined while he was president. They weren't there originally because they hadn't ratified the Constitution yet. 3 brand new states came in when George Washington was president. Vermont in 1791, Kentucky in 1792, and Tennessee in 1796. So that's a little bit about George Washington's presidency. To sum it up, he kept slavery strong. He kept slavery going. He kept us out of the British and French wars, although he did make a lot of the Democratic Republicans angry by signing a treaty with England, Jay Treaty. And he, along with his Federalist point of view, he made the national bank, and he raised taxes on whiskey, which made the federal government stronger, but again, made the states' rights people upset. He retired, and 2 years after his retirement, he passed away at his house in Mount Vernon, Virginia. After this lesson, we'll move on to see the rivalries between the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists. Thanks for watching. Stay safe, cover your cough, wear a mask if you go outside, and remember to wash your hands. See you next time. Bye-bye.